So just kind of give you a rundown because we've got about 45 minutes here. And like I said, I want to leave a good chunk of time for Q&A. So we'll go through, what is vulnerability disclosure? If you're brand new to this, give you kind of a rundown. If you've done this before, we'll have a little bit of a refresher. We'll talk about who finds vulnerabilities. So there's a little bit of a difference in terms of when you're working with someone who might be a security researcher versus a project user. We'll talk about that. Where we're really going to focus actually is an area called coordinated vulnerability disclosure, which is one way to do vulnerability disclosure. And it is my recommendation. It is the OpenSSF's Open Source Security Foundation's recommendation. We'll talk about that, how to get it set up for your project, talk about kind of some common, they've called them troubleshooting things, places where people, I think I've seen the most questions, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So, and we'll kind of use a framework of following a vulnerability from reporting through disclosure to guide us. So, let's start with what happens when someone finds a security issue or a vulnerability. Once that person does, they actually have a couple choices. It's not just defaulting to disclose. There's a few things they can do with it, including they can exploit it. If they found something that lets them abuse your compute resources and that's of interest to them, they're like, hey, I do want to mine some Bitcoin. That's it. They can. It's crime time, so to say. They could sell it. There is actually a market for vulnerabilities. This is different from bug bounties. We'll talk about that in a second. But some of these markets are unregulated, and so it's a little bit controversial. But the option is there, and the payout, depending on the exploit, can be quite generous. So that's one option that your finder has. And then the third is that they could disclose it. And that's the part that we're really going to focus on. So vulnerability disclosure is just a process for verifying, documenting, communicating a known vulnerability. And there's actually many ways that this works. There's not just one right way to do it. There's actually kind of a lot of philosophy behind it, various perspectives, points of view. For the most part, everybody comes at it from, I want to protect the user, but people can have different approaches for what they think is the best way to do that. You can kind of put it on a little bit of a scale, starting with full disclosure, which is coming from the perspective of the more information everybody has, the faster they have it, the sooner they can protect themselves. Kind of follows the thinking of, if one person has found this, we should presume that a second person can find it or already has found it. And there's no point in waiting. There's no point in trying to kind of keep things on the down low. Let's just get the information out there so users can take care of themselves and patch things. On the other hand, shift over in that scale, we have private disclosure, which takes the opinion that no, the more we can kind of keep things a little bit more need to know, we can patch quietly. You might see the phrase silent patching thrown around in private disclosure. The more we can do that, we can kind of keep things protected and not just give information to attackers. Coordinated disclosure kind of pulls a little bit from both those camps, and we'll talk about which of those parts do, and that's where we're really going to dive in. So essentially, coordinated disclosure acknowledges that both the product or project owner has something they want to get out of it. So being you, the open source maintainer, you probably want to protect your users, protect your project. And the reporter, the person who's found the issue, also has something they want to get out of it. And so coordinated disclosure says, okay, let's balance those needs because they're both relevant. They're both, we should respect both of them. Let's figure out how we're going to work together and do both those things. So here, I do want to pause a little bit and talk about the difference between vulnerability disclosure and a bug bounty, because I think seeing a lot more in open source bug bounty stuff, and I think it's getting folks a little bit confused on what the differences are. So essentially, vulnerability disclosure programs are a method for people to report findings for something. It's assuming that you're probably using this. And you've gone along and said, oh, I'm encountering this weird bug, and I think this weird bug actually presents a security issue. What am I supposed to do with it? It may or may not involve cash reward for someone who finds something and reports something. And their scope, meaning what they'll take a report on, usually has to do with kind of their sphere of influence or control around remediation. So for example, your mobile phone may or may not take a report about the kernel because that's not really fully in their sphere of control. If something needs to get remediated in the kernel, it should go over to the kernel community. Report shouldn't go to your mobile phone provider, even though they use Linux. So you can kind of give it a persona as, if you find an issue, please tell me. A bug bounty program, on the other hand, is offering a reward, kind of dangling that incentive, saying, please go look for issues here, and putting a payout on finding something there. Those reports can be funneled into a disclosure program, because if you get a report, it's legitimate. You do want to go through the processes of remediating and disclosing, but not necessarily. Some folks set up one and don't set up the other. And scope of what people will take bug bounty reports on really tends to do more with what they're willing to pay out for. So they might say something is, has a low exploitability score. We don't pay out for those. And so they won't take them. That would be different from a vulnerability disclosure program that would probably be very interested to at least hear about it, regardless of its exploitability score. And if you're interested in this space and you don't already know who Cve Assignment is, I'd really encourage you to look her up, read some of her work, see some of her talks, follow her. She's really a pioneer in this disclosure space and bug bounty practices. And I love this metaphor from her about the context here is that an organization, this is kind of a rather public oops, they had a very flashy bug bounty program from day one of their operations, and they had no team and no process for remediating vulnerabilities. So they got a bug bounty report, they paid out for it, and then it just sat there. And she kind of drew this metaphor of a restaurant where you wouldn't open and say, hey, we're open for opening day, without having your line cooks, your wait staff, your menu prepared, like all those basics. So you can kind of think, if we're going to address these in a maturity scale, bug bounties come after we're really good at intaking reports, patching them, disclosing them. Then we're ready to turn a fire hose on. So with that, let's jump back to CVD, Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure, and talk a little bit about what our reporter wants in terms of a vulnerability disclosure program, not a bug bounty program. Because people can have a lot of reasons for reporting an issue to you, and it really depends on who they are. And you're going to want to consider that for how you work with them. So granted, these are sweeping generalizations, but just to give folks kind of a sense of these two personas, a security researcher is someone whose job is really built around finding these issues, finding novel issues, finding interesting things. I think researcher epitomizes their role in the world. They might end up be submitting to papers and to conferences. It's very important to them to get credited. That's really kind of can be a big part of their career growth. Because of deadlines for conferences and papers and credits, they might be on a certain time frame that they need things disclosed by. And depending on who they are, their interest in helping you patch the issue and seeing things through to resolution could be wildly different. They might be really curious to see and help you out. They might be like, nah, here's the report. Can't participate in that bit. So you contrast that with a project user. Their incentive is a little different. They probably really want to see an issue fixed. If they found something that presents a risk to them, they probably do want to see it fixed, is a bigger priority than a particular timeline. They may or may not want credit, and they probably are pretty interested in helping you patch. And neither of these are right or wrong. It's just different perspectives. And I think it's kind of important to keep in mind as you're working with someone who sent you a report, who might they be and what might be their motivations, their incentives. Okay, so don't worry about capturing this chart. We're going to go through each bit step by step. Let's go ahead and walk through the steps of CVD. And we'll talk about what you're going to want to set up in your project for each piece. So we kind of went through this a little bit of, first an issue is found. Someone finds something and they made that choice. I'm not going to send it to the market. I'm not going to explain it myself. I want to disclose it. And the first thing they're going to try and figure out how to do is contact you. So this is our security researcher. It's actually my dog, but we're going to we're going to give him a promotion for the day. And so he'd like to contact us. So the first thing I think we want to talk about is who is us within your project. You'll want to have if you're a larger project, a small group of people designated to handle security issues. You don't want everybody on a large team, like let's say there's 20 contributors, you don't want all 20 folks on a vulnerability management team. That's a few too many cooks in the kitchen, a few too many people with need to know details. 3 to 5 tends to be a pretty solid number. If you're a small project and there's just 3 contributors, congratulations, all 3 of you are going to be on the vulnerability management team. And I should also say, these people do not have to be security engineers. I think as we go through this process, you'll see that the most important part is organization and management and communications and triage. It's not necessarily, I know exactly how this part of this networking bug is working. I know what's going on exactly here. You can always find that. I think particularly in the open source community, people are really willing to help out and say, I can step in and help you address this issue. So don't feel like your vulnerability management team has to be, top of the line security engineers. So our reporter is going to try and figure out how to contact us. You are going to want to have a very obvious and easy way for them to do that. I say obvious because I think some teams, they put directions buried really far in their documentation. Or you can think about this from an outside researcher's perspective. If the directions are buried in a folder that's like, here's my directory domain of like project, governance, community stuff, security docs, they're not going to find it because I don't think that governance community is the bells are not going to go in their head of, oh, that's the folder I'm looking for. So usually recommend to kind of put it at a top line file somewhere in there. We'll talk a little bit more about some specifics if you're using GitHub. And easy, I really encourage people to use either common tools in developer practices or a tool your project is already using. If someone wants to report something to you, you don't want them to have to go through the friction of spinning up some new and specific account that they haven't used before. You kind of want to think of how many steps am I putting in front of this person and how can I remove many of them. And for that reason, I'm of the opinion, and I think a lot of folks in the open source foundation vulnerability disclosure working group are as well, that email's okay. Sometimes people have concerns about email security. I think most of your major email providers used full, end-to-end encryption more or less. So I think the email is quite fine. And if you are using a particular tool, like for example, you're using Launchpad in taking security issues, I think it's a good idea to have email as backup, just in case for some reason your reporter can't get something to work and they just say, I just want to send off an email. So what this template is commonly called is your security policy. And you frequently see it, particularly if you're a GitHub user, as a security.md file. And this is where we want to put our directions of how to find the vulnerability management team. And with those directions, you're going to want to put what you want them to include. So if you would find it helpful for triage to include a proof of concept, saying, how can I recreate this issue? If versions are helpful, saying, what version did you find this in? Kind of any of those things are really good to have up front. And then I think a really important thing is setting communication expectations. So you can kind of think of this like a customer service interaction. If you send an email for help and you hear nothing for a week, you're probably going to assume that no one is helping you. And if you just get that radio silence, you're going to go, well, what's my plan B? How else can I turn this in? But if you get confirmation that says, we got your ticket and we're working on it or we're looking at it, that at least tells you that, somebody's taken a look, you're going to get some help is on the way. So think about what's reasonable for your project and put those expectations in writing of, we'll acknowledge your issue within this many days, or we do our best to do that. So a couple notes about GitHub I mentioned. So if you're going to use that security.md file, you're going to want to put it in either the docs, root, or .github directories. That way it'll auto-populate. Or actually, you know what? Let me jump to the next slide. That'll show you. Yeah, it'll auto-populate that tab that you see that says security. That's what it pulls from. And I think we're seeing also a handful of these kind of security health scanners coming out, and a lot of them are looking for, does this project use vulnerability disclosure? Do they have a written policy? And a lot of them, what they're doing is pulling from the same setup. So they're looking for the docs, the root, or .github. So if that's you, you use GitHub, something to keep in mind. I'll go back real quick on this slide for a note about GitHub issues. So, the whole reason we're having these things go through email, things go through like a security ticket is so it's not widely spread before anybody gets a chance to take a look. We're not following that full disclosure model. So for that reason, do not use GitHub issues for security issues. At the time of this talk, which is October 2021, they do not have a way to keep a issue, set it as excuse me. Someone cannot, open up a GitHub issue and click security and have it go to a different setting. It's all public. That is different from the GitHub security advisory feature, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so a reporter has found our security.md file. They've got their directions. They've sent us their report. And the next thing for the vulnerability management team is assessment. So not everything is actually a vulnerability. Vulnerabilities are issues that result in unintended access and compromised data. Particularly, we tend to look for things around data integrity, data availability, and data confidentiality. That's kind of our signalers for saying compromised data. Something that is just a bad design decision or a suggestion for improvement is not a vulnerability. And you can just treat them as regular issues. There's no reason for them to be private. You can just make them public and folks can get to work on them. But if you have, unintended and one of those three areas of data are compromised, then you've probably got a vulnerability. So we can have a little look at this chart a little bit. I know there's a ton of text. I'll give you links at the end where all this stuff lives. So don't worry about having to write things down. But you want to be clear with your reporter of what way you're going to classify this when you look at it. Say, nope, this is working as intended. With this one, I think it's important to explain why you made that decision, because I've seen a few times where reporter gets back, this is working as intended, and no other information. And it's actually, there was a miscommunication maybe in the original report or how the vulnerability management team understood the report. And it's just kind of a common trip up. So I say, if you're going to go with working as intended, explain why you came to that resolution. You can say, this is just a regular bug, please open an issue. This is actually a feature request, please open an issue. Or you have decided, yes, we've recreated this. This is a vulnerability. We're going to kick off our process. So, yep. Oh, I think I skipped over. Thank you is always the first thing to say to a reporter. Even if it doesn't come in perfectly, even if it doesn't come in how you exactly wanted it, they've done you a huge favor. And so, reaching out to you, taking that time should always start off with thank you. So we confirm that we've recreated the report and we're moving on to patching. So like we were remembering with the security researchers, with the users, people have a lot of different motivations and they might not be interested in spending the time to see it through to a resolution. That part of the issue might not interest them. But on the flip side, don't assume that somebody is too busy or it's not a priority for them to do that, because they might actually be really looking forward to figuring out how to patch this novel thing they found. So you can always ask. And I think in open source, none of us are in a place to say no to extra hands. So it doesn't hurt to ask and find out if they'd like to help you out with patching. Something that's important about patching work is that it should be done in a private environment with restricted access. So that is where, if you're a GitHub user, you can use what's called the GitHub Security Advisory feature. And you can open up a private branch that is visible only to particular members of your GitHub repo, as well as you can add the reporter as a collaborator on there. If you don't use GitHub, in the full guide that I'll link to at the end, there's some recommendations about other tools and kind of the qualities you're going to want to look for keeping private environments. Okay, and then we are moving on to Cve assignment, because we've got this patch in progress, and at the same time, we're going to want to get that number. And I know we've talked about folks have different reasons for crediting. I think a default position is to assume that people want credit for what they find in the CVE entry. But again, important to ask, and some people might want their name credited in a particular way as well. So CVEs, common vulnerabilities and exposures, although I don't think they just use their acronym now quite often. Essentially, it's a ID system for vulnerabilities, and you're going to want to get an ID number assigned. It helps folks run scanners. It helps folks link to full details about things. And it can also, it feeds into the CVSS score, which is a scoring system for CVEs. And those have differences between exploitability, so how easy or difficult it is for something to be exploited, and severity, what that blast radius, that impact is if it is exploited. And the folks that issue CVEs are called CNAs, CVE Numbering Authority. So you can't necessarily just go do this yourself. And you're going to want to know one CNA contact. I recommend before kind of proceeding down this route, it's good to have someone in your back pocket. If you work for a company, they might have open source in their scope of what they're willing to issue CNAs for. They might not. If you use GitHub, GitHub is willing to be a CNA for any open source project developed on its platform. And MITRE, who manages the CVE program, calls themselves, a CNA of last resort. So if you're like, I really don't know anybody, my company doesn't have open source in their scope, we don't use GitHub, things like that, you can use MITRE. And so if you recall back to the security policy that we had, there was this odd bit about we follow a 90-day disclosure timeline. So let's talk a little bit about what on earth is that? So there's kind of this industry etiquette that's come up around this 90-day timeframe. And I think I have to thank my colleagues at Project Zero at Google. I think they really pushed this and kind of made it I wouldn't say it's a universal standard, but it's common. So this is getting back to the coordinated part of coordinated disclosure. With that agreed upon timeline, the reporter knows that you're not going to sit on their finding indefinitely, and it is going to get disclosed. It is going to get shared with everyone. It also lets you kind of plan ahead, know when things are going to go out, get your communications arranged, get whatever you need to do. I think you will find that it's not necessarily like I said, it's not necessarily universally agreed upon. And there might be cases where the reporter says, no, that's not going to work for me, or I don't want that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that bit in troubleshooting. So we've got our CVE, we've got our patch. And now you'll see on this chart here, there's this optional step, embargo notification. I think for most open source projects, this is probably unnecessary. That's my opinion. Embargo notification is essentially setting up a system in which you are going to have a restricted set of users who get early access to this information. And they might get access about when a patch is coming. They might get information about what's going on and the mitigation that they'll be expected to apply. And usually you do this in cases where your end user, because perhaps there's a really big ecosystem built up around an open source project, the end user is not going to be in control of updating themselves. So you think about if I'm on a managed service and I don't control the particular components update where this vulnerability is, I'm really at the mercy of my vendor to do that update for me. And that's where embargo notification comes into play. So we can protect those users. That early notification, adding this really adds a whole nother level of responsibility on the vulnerability management team. You want to be really cognizant that this is not about avoiding PR issues or preferential treatment. You need to be treating everyone fairly. Really need to be making sure that people who are requesting access are doing So only because they are in that situation where they're responsible for applying a patch, their end user can't do it. So it takes a lot, it adds a lot of overhead to the process. And I would say, solidly for 8, 9 out of 10 of open source projects, that overhead is far more than its relevancy. But it's in there, and in the guide I linked to at the end, there's a few more words about embargo notification as well. So whether we're doing embargo notification or not, we do have our patch, we've got our CVE number, and now it's time to do some disclosure. And so we're going to have quite a few communications pieces that we're going to need to spin up. We want to be able to tell our users what's going on, what is affected, and what they need to do. In the pieces that you're going to want to write for disclosure, you're going to want to stay pretty factual, stick to what people need to know. You can kind of save stories of, oh my gosh, this wild vuln came in and it was just, bananas times, and save things like that for tech talks and blogs. And you're going to want to post it in places where people can easily find it. Going back to kind of that obvious and easy principle from the beginning, if we bury these things away, users won't find it and they won't upgrade. So thinking about things like, should your project have a security announcements mailing list, posting it on the security tab if you are a GitHub user. For really severe issues or very urgent issues, some people also just send it out to their general user mailing list. Say, this is big enough, you need to take immediate action. We're sending it to everyone. So this is what a typical security advisory looks like. And there are some templates for this in the guide that I'll link to at the end. The more you can have templated for your project before you have an issue, the better. It'll make things go super fast. There's also it's nice to your users that they can expect the same format every time. So they'll kind of get used to what fields are going to happen and where they find the information they need. And when it comes to security advisories, there's really no point in hiding any sort of information. Withholding details, anything like that. You want your users to have everything they need to know to be able to recreate the issue themselves if they need to be able to apply the patch, to understand what's going on. Kind of pulling from that full disclosure mindset that we were talking about at the beginning, if one person found it, someone else probably already has. So there's no point in kind of obfuscating some of these details. And of course, our reporter that came in should be kept up to date on what's going on. So give them a heads up of when this will all be dropping, like that timeline you agreed on, but just that constant good communication and updates of what's going on. And again, saying thank you, because it's just, they've done you a huge favor. It's really important. And yes, the dog liked the smooth process. So there you have it. That's kind of a high-level overview of taking a vulnerability from someone found something all the way through to disclosing and sharing with users for your open source project. A lot of these materials were built off of the Open Source Security Foundation's Vulnerability Disclosure Working Groups guide. So if you go to that GitHub link down there, you'll see a full guide and some repositories with things like the templates for security advisories, templates for disclosure notifications. You also see a run book. So after you kind of familiarize yourself with the process, if you just need a quick refresher in the moment of a report, you can go through those steps. And you can kind of make a fork of that and customize, modify however it needs to be for your process, or excuse me, for your project. And I do want to take note that I think I mentioned that we would go through some troubleshooting stuff. I'm going to stop and take a look at the chat because we only have about 10, 15 minutes, and I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions, if there are questions. I don't see questions in the chat, but I'll pause for a minute if folks have things they'd like to ask. And yes, Katie Mazoris, I think doing quite a bit with Zoom was one of her many, many things. I think she also did some very interesting stuff with Clubhouse. I was going to say TikTok, but I think it was Clubhouse recently as well. Okay, I don't see any questions. So feel free to drop them in the chat. Oh, was there one? Are you involved in OSS Fuzz? I myself am not. That is some of my colleagues. So OSS Fuzz is an open source, well, actually there's two components to it. So OSS Fuzz is essentially a fuzzing service. If you're not familiar with fuzzing, it's kind of this security testing of, I'm going to really oversimplify fuzzing, but let's throw a bunch of stuff at a program and see if we can trigger something like a buffer overflow or some sort of security issue, so we can catch that and we can correct it. So OSS Fuzz, I think they've done like hundreds of reports or projects, and they kind of just run it against some of kind of your larger open source projects to get results back and share that with them so those projects can take action. And if you want the infrastructure yourself, that is actually also open sourced. It's called ClusterFuzz, is the infrastructure component of that. I think for a lot of folks, running that infrastructure themselves is not feasible. And so that's why there's OSS Fuzz. But if you're interested, you can check it out at ClusterFuzz. All right, I'll keep going with some troubleshooting, but feel free to drop questions in the chat. Want to make sure we get time for those. Okay. So what should you do if someone just posts something on Twitter? Kind of the silver lining here is that it's already public. If it's out there, it's out there. And so you don't have to go through kind of some of those early stages of your process of, coordinating with the reporter of what's our timeline going to be. Do you want to be involved in patching? You can skip some of that because it's already out there. So you can really just file it as a regular issue, but then you're still going to want to go through your process around writing communications, because users will be looking to the project to kind of clarify and verify what is going on, what is affected, and what do I need to do. I also think it's kind of like that saying thank you. Even though this might not have been your preferred way to get a vulnerability report, I wouldn't, scold, judge, criticize the person who's posted this, because they still let you know about the issue. If you go back to those options they had, they could have said nothing, and then your users and you wouldn't know. They could have sold it. They could have exploited it themselves. So even though this might not have been your preferred way, it still is thank you. They've done a favor by telling you something. Another one, common kind of troubleshooting here, is that the reporter and the vulnerability management team, they're kind of going back and forth about timeline. And the reporter says, no, I really want this disclosed in this many number of days. 90 is not going to work for me. And, I think if you are thinking you're going to need more time, it's helpful to try and figure out why. Is there something like an event or a paper deadline that's driving them? And maybe there's a way you can help them submit to that while pushing out your timeline longer. It could just be that they see this vulnerability as very high severity. And sometimes when there are high severity vulnerabilities in the industry, frequently people will try and turn them around in 7 days or less. So that might be the perspective. They're saying, oh, nope, this is far more important. 90 days isn't going to work. Or they just might not like it. They might disagree with the philosophy, and it kind of is what it is. So, you're going to have to more or less work with whatever they come back to you with, and take it from there. And speed up your timeline where you can, or you can say, we're just not going to be able to make that timeline. The reporter's going to move ahead with disclosure, and then you'll treat it sort of like that 0-day disclosure situation that we were talking about in the slide earlier. And I think the final one that people have challenges with are, it's day 87, it's day 86. Well, actually, if you're that far down the line and you don't know that you're not going to be able to patch this by day 90, you're asking that question too late. So let's say it's, day 60 something. There's no way we're going to get this fixed. This is a really gnarly issue. We just can't sort it out. Sometimes, you can work with your reporter and say, here's what's going on. We can't sort this out. Are you willing to give us 30 more days? They might even have a creative solution for what's going on. But either way, you can think about how can you break that exploit chain? So maybe you don't have a fix that works for all use cases, but you can at least get something. You can release a partial patch that kind of plugs things up a little bit while you get more time and work towards a full resolution. So those were kind of my 3 things that I think I've seen folks struggle the most with when they're trying to do coordinated disclosure in their open source project. And I know, this was a lot of information, and projects are in very different stages about how many contributors they have on hand to do this kind of thing. But I think the more that you can think about what your response would be and get yourself set up and have a plan beforehand, the better off you'll be if you do get a report that says, hey, I found something in your project. So the Open Source Security Foundation, like I said, they've released this guide. There's templates, there's directions. If you have issues, we would love to hear about them. Please open issues. If you use the guide and you find it really helpful, that would be fantastic. If you're willing to share your helpfulness publicly, you can open up a good issue for us and let us know. Or you can contact the OSSF Vuln Working Group directly and let us know.